I want to thank you for your warm welcome of my wife and I here today. And I bring you greetings from your sisters and brothers at Journey at Christ Church, where I serve. Out of the 5 physical senses, sight and hearing and touch and smell and taste, which is the most important to you? This is interactive. You can. Sight. Anybody else? Smell. They're all kind of important. But if you were to do without one of them, which one would you be able to do without? Which one would be the one that's most difficult to do without? For me, it would be sight, and I think many of you would be in the same boat. This morning, we're going to think about how we see. There's a town in Georgia called Peachtree City. It's actually a kind of a suburb of Atlanta, and in that town, there is a huge retirement community. And one of the hallmarks of that little city, it boasts a network of more than 100 miles of golf cart paths. And I'd like to share a true story from Peachtree. One evening, 2 women decided to go to a concert. One of the women was blind, and the other was able to see. And so the blind woman said, "Well, why don't you take my golf cart and you drive?" And so they took off, and on the way to their concert, they decided they'd stop at a local eatery and have dinner. After dinner, they headed for the amphitheater for the concert. And when they got there, the sighted woman said, "Oh, how great it was that the blind woman's husband had put lawn chairs and jackets in the back of the golf cart for them." And the blind woman thought, well, that didn't sound right, but she was blind and she didn't know. Maybe her husband had done that. But she did know that she had packed a cooler that had some drinks in it for them to drink during the concert. And it was not in the golf cart. And so they decided it must have fallen out on the way. And so they jumped back in the golf cart to retrace their steps back to the restaurant. Just then, another golf cart pulled up behind them and shouted the words, "Stop, thief!" And it turned out that they had taken the wrong golf cart when they left the restaurant. It was the same make and the same model. It was a slightly different color of blue, which had the blind woman been able to see, she probably would have known. But to the other woman, the key fit, and so off they went with the wrong golf cart. The moral of this great golf cart caper is that oftentimes we see what we want to see. The first part of Matthew 5 is commonly called the Beatitudes. It's part of the Sermon on the Mount, which is a compilation of many of Jesus' teachings. And these teachings were meant primarily for the disciples, although by this time in Jesus' travels, he was getting quite large crowds, and so the crowds were always welcome to listen in to these the teachings that he gave primarily to his disciples. The Sermon on the Mount was not so much a prescription of how to get into the kingdom or how to get into heaven, as it was how to live in right relationship with God. And it applies as much today as it did 2,000 years ago. Each of the Beatitudes, easy for me to say, begins with, "Blessed are," or in the translation we heard today, "Happy are people," and then it finishes the phrase. I think that happy isn't a strong enough term for what Jesus was trying to say. it would be more appropriate to say, you are truly fortunate to be in such an enviable state of joy that, although blessed are is a lot easier to say, and probably Jesus said it better, there are 9 statements, in the Beatitudes, and I suppose one could preach a sermon from each one of them. And so today I want to focus on just one of the Beatitudes, the 6th one. Blessed are the poor in heart, for they will see God. Or to paraphrase, those who are poor in heart are truly fortunate to be in such an enviable state of joy because you will see God. Which brings us back to sight. Some years ago, a British study was done where students were sent to a room where they were asked to stay for 2 minutes. And when they came out, they were asked to make a list of everything they noticed while in the room. Some listed as many as 40 objects in the room, such as tables and chairs and books. However, almost no one mentioned the strong smell of cigar smoke that had been intentionally introduced into that room, nor did anyone mention the loud noises that emanated from the adjacent room. The upshot of the study was that what the students reported is what they saw. They ignored the other senses. The 6th Beatitude promises us a vision of God. And to understand what Jesus meant, we need to realize that there is more than one way to see. First, there is physical sight. We all know what that is. You can see me, I can see you. We go to the eye doctor when the words on the newspaper begin to be blurry or the images on the television become fuzzy. And many times as you sit in the chair at the eye doctor, they'll swing this arm around and it's got a gizmo on it that's got a lot of lenses, and they zero in on the right one, and hopefully with the right corrective lenses they can bring our vision back to 20/20. That is physical vision. Then there is what I would refer to as mental vision. The mind can often fill in what the eyes miss. Take, for example, the treasurer when she makes her financial report to the board. If it's a verbal report, many of us will sit there and scratch our heads and scrunch up our faces and not really understand. But if, before she makes her report, she passes out a spreadsheet that has the income and expenditures and then makes the report, we're able to say, now I see. Well, we really don't see. It has far less to do with physical sight than it does with the brain's ability to understand, to comprehend, and it begins to make sense to us. A good author will often tell a story in a way that we can see in our mind's eye what she or he is describing. And we say that author has painted a word picture for us. That is not physical sight, that is mental vision. And lastly, we have spiritual vision. Spiritual vision might be called the eyes of the heart. It is the ability to discern spiritually where our physical eyes cannot see and our mental vision cannot understand. Spiritual vision is the ability to understand abstract truth. For example, how many believe that God's presence is here in this room? Okay, good. I do too. Now, how many can see God? Me neither. Our hearts can grasp the reality of God's presence, even when we can't physically see God. There is a strong correlation between spiritual sight and faith. Hebrews 11:1 tells us that faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance of what we do not see. When Jesus said, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God," to what type of vision was Jesus referring? I believe he was talking about spiritual vision. It's a part of the human condition that what we see depends largely on what we want to see. And the great golf cart keeper is an example. Very often, we only see what we want to see. Genesis, the first chapter in Genesis, tells us that we are made in the image of God. So when we look at each other, we ought to be able to see the image of God in one another. And I would suggest that sometimes we're not very good at seeing the image of God because we're not really looking for the image of God. Our physical sight may be 20/20, but our spiritual sight is not nearly so keen. Now, I don't know anything about the history of this church, but I'd be willing to bet that somewhere in your history there were a few men and women, maybe people who were related to you, who said, "You know, I think we need a church here in Ottawa. As I look around, I see people made in the image of God who need to hear the good news. People who need the hope that only comes from a saving knowledge of Jesus Christ. And I think we can make that happen." These people didn't see with physical vision, didn't see God with physical vision any more than we do. But they had spiritual vision. When we prayed the Lord's Prayer just a few minutes ago, one of the phrases we prayed was, "Give us this day our daily bread." Now that could mean, give us the food that we need for today. And for many people, that's exactly what the prayer means. Or, food could be a metaphor for any or all of our other needs. And I would suggest that God almost always uses other people to fill our needs, and God uses us to fill the needs of others. Sometimes that is food for today, and sometimes it's something completely different. In other words, I believe there are times when you and I may really truthfully be the answer to someone else's prayer. The challenge for us is to see the need. Because often we need to see with spiritual eyes what a person's need really is. When we see a picture of a child from the third world with a distended stomach and nothing but skin and bones, we know that that child needs food. It's obvious. We can see that with our physical eyes. But what about your neighbor who may be well fed? What are his or her needs? Those needs may not be so visible to the physical eyes. But the need is still there, and it is still there waiting to be met by us. But it must be seen with spiritual eyes. Now that need may be as simple as a smile or a hug, or it may be something far more complex. The challenge for us, friends, is that we need to look at our community, to look at our church, to look at each other with spiritual vision see the image of God, and ask, how can I share the love of Jesus with those that I rub elbows with every day? It's a question to dwell on over lunch today. Will you pray with me? Holy God, we love you and want to do your will. But it's so easy to overlook the needs of those around us. Open our eyes, Lord. Improve our spiritual vision. Help us to see more like Jesus. Help us to be more like Jesus. And it is in his name that we pray. Amen.